we are now experiencing the height of Jesus' admiration and adoration because He's the Passover lamb that had to be chosen, and the people had to know, and the people had to love. On the day that the Passover lamb is chosen, Israel chooses her Passover lamb, which is Jesus. Only they didn't know it. Today is the day that we recognize and we celebrate this event in the life of Jesus known as Palm Sunday or Triumphant Entrance Sunday. This is the day in which Jesus enters into the holy city to begin the events of what's known as the Passion Week, leading up to, of course, His arrest and crucifixion on Friday of this week, and then His resurrection on Resurrection Sunday, which we will observe next Sunday. So today is a day for us to set aside from our regular study in Paul's letter to the Ephesians to turn our thoughts and our hearts towards Jesus' entrance into the city. This event of Jesus' life, I submit to you, is one of the most overlooked and underappreciated events in all of Jesus' life. I hope that by the end of our time this morning, you would agree with me that Jesus' triumphant entry into the city of Jerusalem stands as one of the greatest events of His life, maybe second only to His resurrection, and should be viewed as by His people as such, that we should take great joy and great enthusiasm in celebrating Jesus' entrance into the city, nearly as much so as we do on Resurrection Day. So I hope that you will see this as we open the Scriptures this morning. And I pray that through the Scriptures this morning that God will give unto you the same kind of joy and enthusiasm that those who were accompanying Jesus into the city had on that holy day. So we could turn to any of the Gospels to take a look at this because we can see from the fact that all four of the Gospels include this, we can see something of the importance of the event. You may have noticed that up until this point in Jesus' life, there's only one other event that all four Gospels record, and that would be the multiplying of the bread and fish. After this event, during the Passion Week, all four Gospels are going to record, of course, Jesus' institution of the Passover on Thursday, of the supper, and then His arrest, trials, and His crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection. All four Gospels will record those. But up until this point in Jesus' life, only one other event has been recorded by all four Gospels, the multiplying of the bread and fish. So that says something to us about the significance and the importance that all four Gospel writers placed upon this event in Jesus' life. All four Gospels don't record His baptism. Only two Gospels record His birth. So this stands as an event in Jesus' life and in His ministry of utmost importance for us this morning. So let's turn to look at the story of Jesus' entrance into the city. And again, we could look at any of the Gospels. But I'm going to choose, no big surprise here, Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 19. And we'll look at Luke's account of Jesus' entrance into the city from Luke chapter 19. And Luke chapter 19 begins with the story of Zacchaeus. Jesus enters into the city from Jericho. So Jesus, prior to entering the city, was in Jericho. In Jericho, He heals the two blind men, restores their sight. He also has that encounter with Zacchaeus. And then after that, Luke records the parable of the 10 minas. The parable of the 10 minas plays significantly into the meaning of the entrance into the holy city later in chapter 19. So immediately before this comes the parable of the 10 minas. And right after this, beginning from verse 28, we see the recording of Jesus' entrance into the city. So Jesus is going to enter into the city to His coronation. This is a coronation like no other, as we will see. Let's begin by reading the passage together from verse 28. And when He had said these things being the parable of the 10 minas, when He had said these things, He went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When He drew near to Bethphage and Bethany, at the mount that is called Olivet, He sent two of the disciples, saying, Go into the village in front of you, where on entering you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever yet sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, Why are you untying it? You shall say this, The Lord has need of it." So those who were sent went away and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord has need of it." And they brought it to Jesus, and throwing their cloaks on the colt, they sat Jesus on it. And as he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and to praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." So Jesus is entering into the city now, and this will be his coronation. Now, this is a coronation like no other coronation ever in history, because this is a coronation of contrasts. This is a coronation of contradictions. Jesus enters into the city to enthusiastic, joyful reception, but his response to that is grief. He enters into praises and lauding on the part of the people, and his response is grief and weeping. He enters into the cries of the people, ready to receive him as a conquering hero that will set them free. But what he says to them is he pronounces woe and destruction upon them that's worse than even the occupation that they hoped he would free them from. He enters into the reception of a people that are ready to take him and make him king and put him on the throne. But instead, he goes straight to the cross. He enters into a people ready to receive him with joy and acceptance. And the only words he has for them are words of condemnation. This is like no other coronation ever in history. So as Jesus enters into this coronation type event, this is, as we said earlier, one of the most significant events of Jesus' life. And if we understand this properly, this is one of the most encouraging things that Jesus ever did in his ministry for us today. So let's begin looking at this from verse 28. And when he had said these things, of course, being once again the parable of the 10 minas, when he had said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is higher in elevation than everything around it. And so whenever you go to Jerusalem, you're going up. He's going up to Jerusalem. He's been on the way to Jerusalem now in Mark's Gospel for about 10 chapters. Ever since chapter 10 in Mark's Gospel, he's had his face set upon Jerusalem. All of the Gospel writers record this journey to Jerusalem that is extended and very detailed in their recounting of it. This journey to Jerusalem is what Jesus has been on now for some weeks. In fact, we really could say that this journey to Jerusalem is about to conclude a journey that began in Bethlehem. Jesus starts this journey to Jerusalem in Bethlehem, goes to Egypt, comes back to Nazareth, back and forth to Jerusalem a few times, to Galilee a few times, Samaria, and now finally concluding in Jerusalem. Really, though, this journey to Jerusalem began before eternity began. Before time was created, before Jerusalem existed, Jesus was on the way to Jerusalem. Now this journey is about to conclude as he's coming here to Jerusalem from Jericho. Now as he comes from Jericho, it's a 17-mile road from Jericho to Jerusalem. And over that 17 miles is an increase in elevation of almost 4 miles. So over 17 miles and an increase in 4 miles tells us that that's quite an arduous road. So as he's traveling from Jericho, we remember the things that happened in Jericho. Zacchaeus, the blind men healed, the teachings that he gave there, and he's traveling on this road up from Jericho. As he's traveling, there is a massive group of people with Jesus. Jesus' popularity has never been greater. He is loved by all the people, or nearly all the people we could say at this point. His following is greater than it's ever been in his entire ministry. Multitudes of people are with Jesus as he's traveling on the way to Jerusalem. So we picture Jesus with this huge entourage of people. People that include people of all walks of life that have received from Jesus physical healing, spiritual healing, cleansing from leprosy, casting out of demons, restoring of sight. Zacchaeus is among them, this man who has a new life to live, as well as so many others who have a new life because of Jesus. And the mood is absolutely euphoric. They're on the way to Jerusalem to observe Passover, or what the Jews call the Festival of Unleavened Bread. This is one of 3 festivals that the Jews had to celebrate in Jerusalem, or at least the head of the household had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate this festival, along with the Festival of Tabernacles and the Feast of Weeks. Of all 3 of those festivals, over the years, this had become the most popular. Of all 3 festivals, this is the one that still retained the highest level of popularity. And so, along with Jesus, as he travels along this road, is not just he and his apostles and all of his disciples following him, but also this massive group of people that are also on their way to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. The Passover would bring untold tens of thousands of people into Jerusalem for the week. We don't know exactly how many tens of thousands, but it's multitudes of people that would swell into Jerusalem for the week of Passover. 10 years after Jesus' death, the Jewish historian Josephus writes that there were some 260,000 Passover lambs sacrificed that year. 260,000 lambs. If we assume that each lamb represented about 10 people, we realize that Jerusalem is the place of at least 2 million people. An ancient city with no running water, no plumbing facilities. 2 million people have flooded into the city for the week. We can imagine the mass of humanity, but it's humanity that is joyful because Passover was a joyful time. It was a time of remembering that the Lord passed over Israel and the Lord saved them from the death of the firstborn and from slavery. So it's a joyful time. It's a euphoric time. It's a happy time. And so here's Jesus at the height of his popularity, followed by scores of people that he has collected, so to speak, over all of Galilee. Many of them healed physically, many of them healed spiritually, some of them curious, but all of them happy and joyful. And mingled among all of them is this large group of people also making their way. Everybody's going the same direction to Jerusalem. So you can imagine a little bit of the scenario, a little bit of the context, a little bit of what's happening here, of what it would have been like to be traveling along this road from Jericho to Jerusalem. Let's just take a moment and maybe turn on our imaginations, our sanctified imaginations, and imagine a little bit about what it would have been like to be traveling with Jesus on this road at this time. The road was arduous and difficult. So as they're traveling along, we can think maybe what some of the conversations would have been like. Certainly they would have talked about the difficulty of the road, of the difficulty of the climb. Maybe there's older people along with them and they're just talking about how they're can't walk like they used to walk, can't climb like they used to walk. These old knees are wearing out, and those kinds of conversations are going on. They're talking about the weather. They're talking about the road. They're also talking about the conditions of the road itself, because this is the road, remember, that was for so long known to be such a dangerous place to travel. We remember the parable that Jesus told just back in Luke chapter 10, the parable in which he used this road as the setting for the instance in which the Jewish man was mugged and beaten nearly to death on the road to Jericho. Actually, the same road, just going the opposite direction. Now, the road from Jericho to Jerusalem is no longer dangerous because the Romans have taken care of that. The Romans did not tolerate thievery and robbery in the kingdom, not because they cared about people, but because robbery took away the taxes that they wanted to collect, because thieves don't usually pay taxes. So the Romans weren't really excited about everybody on the road from Jericho getting robbed, because that meant they couldn't pay the taxes when they got to Jerusalem or to Jericho, wherever they were going. So for their own self-serving purpose, the Romans had made the road to be very much safe now. But it's so recent in everybody's memory that this was such a dangerous road that, again, Jesus used it as a parable for the setting of someone who's beaten and mugged just on this road. Maybe it could have happened just a few years back. So in everybody's memory is the fact that this road that's now very safe, not too long ago, was very dangerous. And they're talking about that. I remember when this used to be a really dangerous place. Oh, I know so-and-so who got mugged and beaten on this road. Oh, yeah, well, I know two people that had gotten mugged and beaten. I was nearly beaten to death on this road myself. So you can hear the conversations taking place. But boy, I'm glad the Romans are here because this road is safe now. Well, I'll take a dangerous road over these Romans any day. Can't you just imagine how the people are talking? But intermingled with all of that, they're talking about Jesus. They're talking about all the things Jesus has done. They're talking about this person over here that was blind, or this person over here that can now see, this person that was on their deathbed. Or they're talking about the new outlook on life that they now have. And there's just so much excitement. The two men that were blind are there. And they're just still amazed that they can see. They are talking about Zacchaeus. You know, Zacchaeus is among them. And they would look over and somebody would say, that short guy over there, isn't that Zacchaeus? Yeah, that's Zacchaeus. Oh, I hate that guy. I can't stand that guy. Oh, no. He's changed now. You'll like him now. And then sure enough, Zacchaeus sees some. Hey, I remember you. I cheated you 2 years ago, didn't I? Well, let me make that right. Let me make that right now. You can just imagine this scene that's going on. Also, on this trek up the road, this is the occasion in which the mother of James and John come to Jesus. Jesus, when you come to your throne, can my two boys sit on your right and on your left? And Jesus, of course, as we know, answers, there's a cup for me to drink in Jerusalem. And it's my Father's business who sits on my right and who sits on my left. And then the disciples get all sideways with them and with their mother because she asked this inappropriate sort of thing. Also on the way, Jesus is going to find an opportunity to take his apostles aside and tell them for the third time, when we get to Jerusalem, I'm going to be killed. They're going to arrest me. And I'm going to be killed. And the disciples are distraught, but that anxiety doesn't last long because the mood is so high. And everyone is so excited because they're on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover with the one whom they believe to be the Messiah of their land. Now, Jesus has to get to Jerusalem on the exact day that he gets there. He has to get to Jerusalem on Monday. Now, you've heard me allude to the fact previously that Jesus' entry into the city almost certainly, I believe, occurred on a Monday instead of Sunday. When we think of Palm Sunday, really it was on a Monday. I think that is fairly certain from the Scriptures. But I want to just kind of draw our attention to that right now for a couple of reasons that have to do directly with what the meaning of the passage is. One, if you take a look at the back of your worship guide here, I took the time to kind of outline what I think is a pretty good chronology of this last week of Jesus' life. And just to kind of go through it quickly, on Saturday, which was the Sabbath, is the day that Jesus is going to arrive in the village known as Bethany. Bethany is the village where Jesus' close friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead, they live in Bethany. Jesus is going to come to Bethany, And he's going to stay in Bethany at the home of his friends every night of this week leading up to Thursday. He's going to go back and forth to Jerusalem every day. Now, he's going to arrive in Bethany on Saturday or the Sabbath because John tells us in John chapter 12 that Jesus came to the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus 6 days before the Passover. The Passover occurs on Nisan the 14th. Nisan is the first month of the Jewish calendar, and the Passover is always on the 14th day of Nisan. In the year 30 A.D., the 14th day of Nisan, or Passover, occurred on a Friday. We know that the Passover occurred on a Friday the year that Jesus died because he dies the day before the Passover. They've got to rush him into the grave to beat the sundown of the Passover. So Passover is on this Friday. 6 days before that, John tells us in John 12 that Jesus arrives in Bethany. He arrives in Bethany on Saturday to fellowship and to be with his good friends. You remember just how much Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. You remember Jesus crying at Lazarus' tomb. He wants to spend a little time with them. He wants to see them. So he comes, and it's at the village of Bethany that a feast is given for Jesus at the home of Simon the leper. At the home of Simon the leper is where Mary anoints Jesus' feet with the expensive oil. And remember the interchange with Judas that occurs over that. So all that happens on Saturday, 1 week before the Sabbath that Jesus is dead. On the following day, Sunday, John records for us in John chapter 12 that a great crowd of people came from Jerusalem to Bethany because they had heard that Jesus was there and they wanted to see Lazarus. So there's a great amount of curiosity. Jesus is now near the city. A great number of people have heard about him, but they've not seen him yet. So they want to see Jesus, but they also want to see Lazarus because everybody's heard that he was dead and now he's alive again. Intermingled in with that crowd are both admirers, believers, those who are curious, but also there are also conspirators. Because John tells us that not only were they plotting to kill Jesus, but they were also plotting to kill Lazarus as well. So that happens on Sunday. Everybody convenes into this little village of Bethany on the Sunday. They come there, and that takes up most of the events of that day. The following day is Monday, and that's the day that we're told that Jesus then enters into the city, the events that we'll look at today. He enters into the city. Mark chapter 13 tells us that Mark 11 tells us he comes into the city, and after coming into the city, he goes to the temple and looks around, and because it's late, he goes back to Bethany. The next morning, Tuesday, he comes back into the city, cleanses the temple, curses the fig tree, and then goes back into Bethany for that night. Now, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, there's going to be a flurry of teaching and parables and confrontations by Jesus with the religious leaders. He's going to go to the temple and observe the widow putting in her last penny. He's going to tell the parables, some of the parables like the 10 virgins, the parable of the wedding feast, the parable of the wicked son. All those parables get told during that course of time between Tuesday and Thursday. In addition to that, there's also the teachings like when Jesus asks, whose son is the Messiah? Or the question about the greatest commandment, or the question about the resurrection. All those will occur during that. Also, on that Wednesday, Jesus will go into the temple for the last time. The last time his feet ever go into the temple of Herod, he goes in there on Wednesday. That's when he observes the widow giving the offering. That's when he proclaims that this temple will be destroyed. They leave. The disciples say, look at all these stones. Jesus says, all these stones are going to be torn down. And then Jesus leaves and he goes out to a place called the Mount of Olives where he gives what's known as the Olivet Discourse. Then the next day, Thursday, he comes back into town. And on Thursday, this is the day before the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. He comes back in on Thursday. That's the day that they set up the upper room. They observe the Passover there. Jesus gives the upper room discourse. He washes the disciples' feet. Afterwards, they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is arrested either late Thursday night or in the early hours of Friday morning. He then has those 6 phases of a trial or 6 different trials. There's a mistake in your chronology. It should be 6 trials between Pilate, Herod, and the Sanhedrin. So Jesus has 2 trials before the Sanhedrin, 2 before Pilate, 2 before Herod. All of that occurring in the hours of the night and the early morning, so that by mid-morning on Friday, Jesus is convicted, beaten, and put on the cross. He's dead by mid-afternoon, in the grave before sundown, and then the following day, Saturday, which is the Sabbath, He rests in the grave, and then the following day, Sunday, He rises early in the morning and appears to multiple people throughout the day in different places. So that is what I feel is the best chronology for the week. Now, that's important to see for this reason. And that is the 2 reasons that Jesus had to be there in Jerusalem on this day. Jesus had to make it to the Passover on this day because He had to enter the city on the Monday before the Passover on Friday. Here's why. God had declared in Exodus chapter 12. Exodus 12 is where God gives all the regulations of the Passover. And we may not have been aware of this, but when you observed the Passover as a Jewish family, you didn't just eat any old lamb. You didn't just go to the flock and pick a lamb and slaughter it, and that was your Passover lamb. You put the blood on the door and ate it. God instituted in Exodus chapter 12 that the Passover lamb was to be selected on the 10th day of the month, 5 days before the Passover. The Passover is always the 14th day of the month. The Passover lamb had to be chosen on the 10th day of the month, removed from the flock, brought inside, and lived with the family inside for 5 days. So that when that lamb did get sacrificed, it wasn't just any old lamb out of the flock. It was a lamb that they knew, that had lived with them. It had kind of become something like a pet. This was all intentional. All of this, of course, is pointing to Jesus, who would not only live among us for 3 decades, but for 3 years would minister. And so when He is offered up as the sacrificial Passover lamb, it's not just somebody that nobody knew. We are now experiencing the height of Jesus' admiration and adoration because He's the Passover lamb that had to be chosen, and the people had to know, and the people had to love. And so on the day that the Passover lamb is chosen, which is Monday of that week, Israel chooses her Passover lamb, which is Jesus. Only they didn't know it. They choose their Passover lamb in the Hosannas. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's their choosing of Jesus as their Passover lamb. They just didn't know that that's what they were doing.